several books in Hindi. Some of his books are A Political Agenda of Education, Learning from Conflict, The Child's Language and the Teacher, and What is Worth Teaching, A Pedagogue's Romance. In recent years, Professor Kumar has been working on the contribution that education can make to peace between India and Pakistan, an issue that is close to all our hearts. His recent books on this theme are Prejudice and Pride and Battle for Peace. Professor Kumar also writes for children. Earlier today, we reflected with Lynn Lawrence on the dance of life and how the young child learns its rhythms and masters its steps. As each individual then proceeds along this journey through life, she or he often needs the assistance of educators. During his talk, Dr. Krishna Kumar will lead us to contemplate the relationship between the learner and his world, and what therefore needs to be learned. Please welcome Dr. Krishna Kumar.
Esteemed members of the Congress Committee, Dr. Leela Sampson, delegates from different countries and India, children, teachers, friends. It gives me an unusual pleasure and a sense of great privilege to have been asked to address you this morning on the topic of the idea of teaching. My organization, the National Council of Educational Research and Training, has over the recent years drafted, with the help of many of you present here in this Congress, a new national curriculum of education. And its various fruits have begun to appear, and it gives me a great sense of satisfaction that the main ideas of this framework are in deep harmony with the writings and work of Dr. Maria Montessori. One of the most recent activities that we have undertaken in the context of this framework is the introduction of a new subject at the grade 11 and 12 level in India, which is the level of known as the higher secondary level, a subject called Heritage Crafts, which attempts to integrate the ideas of several progressive educators and social activists of the century that has just gone by, ranging from the ideas derived from the works of many whose names have been mentioned since yesterday, including Rukmini Devi Arundale, Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay, and of course, Mahatma Gandhi. In today's lecture, I want to investigate, with your help, the idea of teaching, especially in relation to what has become almost the only context in which we think about teaching, namely learning. I would like to start by inquiring why the idea of teaching has remained somewhat neglected in scientific research, especially when you compare it with the amount of research that has gone into understanding what learning might constitute. And then I would like to move on to the kinds of problems that teachers today face, both in their day-to-day work, in a system which is a system designed for educating everybody, that is, designed to become a universal system of education, rather than what it has been for the long history of education, a system of education which was designed for a few. Teachers today face an entirely new situation, a new context, and quite a few of them feel that they are actually facing a crisis which is partly born out of the manner in which the profession has defined itself, but also out of the circumstances in which the profession of teaching, especially the profession of teaching the young, finds itself. I would like to end by reflecting briefly on what, in the context of teaching, one might say about the meaning of the theme of this conference, namely sadhana, a word which, as was mentioned yesterday, means many things. And indeed, like teaching, is not an easy word to define in a way that might seek a consensus. In fact, that may not be the purpose. So let me begin, first of all, by drawing your attention to the neglect of teaching as an idea, especially when we compare it to the idea of learning. This neglect becomes obvious when we survey the vast corpus of theories and studies done on learning. At least since the late 19th century, learning has been a favorite theme of psychologists and, to a great extent, a favorite theme of philosophers of education as well. Although between the psychologists and the philosophers of education, there hasn't been all that much of a dialogue or harmony. Nevertheless, it's quite obvious that while literature on learning has greatly and speedily grown, the literature on teaching has remained somewhat truncated. Jerome Bruner, one of the greatest living theorists of learning, recently did a summary of research on learning since the late 19th century. And the conclusion that Bruner came to in this summary, published in the journal Daedalus a few years ago, is a conclusion that might give us heart to carry on and not to feel too defeated by this vast corpus of literature available on learning, while writings on teaching remain very few. Bruner pointed out in his conclusion, in this attempt to summarize what all we now know about learning at the end of nearly a century and a quarter of the first scientific studies attempted in the context of learning, what he has to say by way of conclusion in this attempt to summarize this vast body of literature is that we actually don't know much about learning. That perhaps the best we can say at this point is that it's not possible, and perhaps it may not be desirable, to have a universalistic theory of learning. That a great deal of research, especially studies done after the Second War tell us that learning may be something very specific to the context in which the learner lives and grows. That a universalistic theory of learning may in fact do considerable injustice to several kinds of learning. This conclusion is both heartening, you might say, for our present topic, but at the same time it's also a little startling in the sense that even as one theory after another has come up in the context of learning since the early 20th century, one major theory has remained almost, you might say, predominant or in a very well-established position. And that theory has dominated not only the field as such for a very long time now, but has also dominated what our present topic is. It has dominated teaching, dominated both the practice of teaching in various systems of education in the world, which otherwise differ a great deal, but has also dominated the training of teachers, or the factories where modern day teachers are prepared. That word is not very inappropriate, although it might look ironical, the word factory, because the theory actually arose out of that kind of context, the context of an industrializing economy in which the needs of the factory were far more important than the needs of ordinary society. And also a context which, since the early 20th century, seems to have been driven by concerns of war, particularly the concern that one might lose a war. Most European countries and North American countries, and later on even East Asian countries, got into this war-mindedness decades soon after the 20th century had begun, and hardly any country was spared by the thought of being well prepared for war. And hence, this particular theory of learning, which arose in its full, you might say, splendor during the interwar years, has remained quite dominant, despite the fact that within the world of scientific research, this theory has been challenged and has been successfully challenged, at least within the domain of cognitive psychology now. And yet, this challenge has not displaced the theory from its predominant place in defining for millions of teachers around the world, publishers of educational material, producers of educational material, and teacher trainers, what learning might mean, and therefore how teachers should work to aim at that kind of learning. I'm sure it doesn't require much guesswork on the part of such a learned audience as yourselves to guess which theory I'm referring to. Of course, I'm referring to the theory that draws its lineage from Pavlov, the pre-Soviet Russian psychologist, a theory which received very important and great contribution from American psychometricians and psychologists of the stature of Thorndike and Watson, and ultimately Skinner. I'm referring to the vast corpus within which we find many differentiations, the vast corpus of studies made under the umbrella of behaviorism. Behaviorism has remained a dominant name, and where it's not known as a name, that is in the humble primary school of a village, it's known by what it promises to achieve, namely a predictable outcome of the teacher's efforts. I mention it because it astonishes us that while learning has remained such a vibrant theme in the world of scientific psychology, and after the Second World War at least, the theories that were developed in the context of cognitive psychology ultimately seemed to prove that behaviorists were much too simple-minded and were not in a position to tell us how human beings learn, even as they told us quite authoritatively how pigeons might learn. Yet our view of learning has remained shaped and colored by some of the primary assumptions that the behaviorists had made early on in the century. No assumption is more important for us to remember this morning, even as we are beginning to investigate the idea of teaching, than the assumption that human beings can be successfully manipulated. And that assumption is best expressed in Skinner's most famous title, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. When we recall the kind of work which many progressive thinkers and practitioners were doing during the interwar years, and the great concern they expressed for the relationship between education and peace, we find it somewhat strange that it's during those years that behaviorism acquired its stature as an overarching theory which provides a principle to curriculum development and a goal to teacher training. It's a conundrum, you might say, of that part of the times of the 20th century, that on the one hand, you saw the growth of a theory which showed how human beings can be shaped into a desirable or pre-decided design. And on the other hand, some of the best minds of that period, who had established a fellowship for peace, were worried about the contribution that mass education was already making to war. The fellowship I'm referring to had contributions from various great names of that era, ranging from, of course, Dr. Montessori to Rabindranath Tagore and Bertrand Russell and many others. When one looks back at that period, one is not surprised if one sees this development, or what I've called sort of a conundrum, from the perspective which the American philosopher John Dewey gave when he pointed out that by looking back at the concerns and the ways in which these concerns were articulated in the history of education, we can easily guess what must be missing or what must be happening. So if Dr. Montessori was talking about education for peace, a book which has now been brought out in India for the first time by Kalakshetra, surely education was being used for war. If progressive thinkers were talking about the need to use education for the pursuit of freedom and dignity, perhaps what was happening was the opposite, and that's why they were so concerned about it. To read the history of educational thought in this way does help us to contextualize our effort today to redefine both learning and teaching. And this is what perhaps we can start doing by loosening, to begin with, this very tightly woven binary between teaching and learning. As the two primary activities in any educational setting, we tend to think of the two things together. We tend to think of teaching in relation to learning, and we think of learning in formal schools at least in relation to teaching. And when we talk about teaching and learning in this kind of tight and rigid binary, we run the risk of, in a way, forgetting the assumptions which this binary implies. One assumption, for example, would be that the goal of teaching is to enhance learning. And the opposite, you can say, that learning happens as a result of teaching. Now, both these kinds of assumptions would look very questionable if you widened the context, both historically and geographically. The assumption that it's teaching that makes learning happen would belie a very long history of learnings of various kinds that the world has thrived on for millennia. For instance, the beautiful exhibits that you have, I hope, seen by now, presented here by Dastakar, have been made by people or have been inspired by a long heritage of people who, in today's context, would be quite legitimately described as people who are not only illiterate, but also uneducated. The beautiful things which many of you are wearing have been produced by weavers whose children today cannot succeed at school, who in fact constitute a substantial proportion of India's children who are forced to drop out of school, out of a rigid system in which a weaver's son cannot succeed. Howsoever beautiful may be the work that weavers' daughters and children and their fathers and mothers make to make our saris, our beautiful bags, including this one which Kalakshetra has given us. Howsoever remarkable this work may be, satisfying our souls in this era of plastic and mass-produced design, it's not easy to quite comprehend why is it that systems of education not only don't treat the children of this vast population well, but in fact in many countries, including countries of now universally educated populations of the Western world, has actually helped in the destruction of these crafts. Looking at modern United States, Canada, most of Europe, and now the modernizing countries of China and our own, one can say that modern education doesn't look kindly upon this tradition of learning, in which there was no formal teaching involved. That modern education, in fact, disenfranchises the traditional craftsmen and craftswomen from being called teachers. At best, they can be called trainers, a euphemism for people who are otherwise not qualified to enter the formal school. And their entry into universities is, of course, next to impossible, even in the more progressive universities, which are attempting to bridge the gap between the world of the village and its work and the world of the cities, the metropolitan world of development. The teaching-learning binary and the assumptions which it implies is indeed a very tight binary. Not only does it make teaching look like the cause of learning, it also makes learning look like an outcome of teaching. Both these assumptions create a range of problems of the kind that I have just exemplified for you. However, it's not very surprising that this binary should be so popular in our times and has in fact been a dominant construct of the mind both the popular mind as well as the academic mind over more than a century. The reason perhaps can be guessed by looking at the iconoclastic writings of writers like Ivan Illich and Freire, who pointed out to us that the 20th century was somehow obsessed with institutionalization of learning and therefore ignored learning which was taking place outside institutions. Not only ignored, but attempted to delegitimize, if not actively destroy, something which colonialism did in almost all cases of colonization, irrespective of who the colonizer was, whether it was France or Great Britain or Portugal or Spain. In case after case, we find that education was the instrument of colonialism, and at least one dominant meaning of colonialism in education was to delegitimize traditions of learning which had prevailed in those societies. And when delegitimation was not enough, active destruction of those populations had to be carried out, as happened in the case of United States and continues to happen in the context of the tribal communities in many countries, including India. It's necessary, friends, therefore, for us to step out of this binary and see how the world might look if we stopped relating teaching to learning in this very rigid binary. If we decided to loosen the grip of this binary on us, we would notice that the word learner is a very inadequate expression. It diminishes the child. Of course, it diminishes the adult. The old word pupil might be a far better word, because a child or a pupil are far more than a learner. Learner, as we know from the work of important cognitive psychologists like Piaget, is someone who is born to learn and in fact will learn anyhow. That a teacher may not really be so proud of herself if somebody has learned. That in fact, for a great number of children, learning is something they do despite their teachers and despite the institutions which design the curriculum, which teachers are under law forced to follow. One of the great problems of education in modern systems, that the curriculum designer became more important than the teacher, a problem that many countries are still struggling with. This question, therefore, who is a learner, should remind us that the learner is actually doing a lot more than paying attention to the teacher. And that if we were to redefine teaching, or at least if we were to look closely at what teaching is, what its main idea is, what might constitute the core of teaching, at least in the best circumstances, then we have a chance to be hit by a simple fact which otherwise would have been obvious if we were not inheritors of a great tradition of false consciousness about learning. What will hit us is that actually the teacher is somebody who relates, who forms a bond with the pupil and enables the pupil to grow. And in the context of the pupil's growth, more happens of what might have happened anyhow, or that a certain kind of concentration occurs of the pupil's energies, which allows the stopping of what might have become a waste of energies, or at least the teacher's presence permits certain kinds of risks of energies getting wasted to be avoided. that in fact the teacher might actually be serving merely as somebody who is around and whose being around reassures the child in good circumstances, in good schools. A point which the Soviet scientist Vygotsky put across very nicely in a metaphor of scaffolding. Scaffolding, which would mean that the teacher provides an unthreatening presence, an encouraging presence to the child. And it's the presence which makes a difference. Otherwise, the agency is already in the child, something which it has taken Europe more than 2 centuries to fully absorb, and many other countries in the world have still not absorbed, namely that the agency to learn and grow resides in the child. And all that we need to do as adult teachers is to be around in our loving, affectionate presence with compassion and with hope. The hope that something will continue to happen and that my presence will not come in the way of the child's attempt to learn. Such a view of teaching, of course, creates numerous problems for us to carry on this reflection, particularly in the context of what most teachers find a great obstacle in their attempt to see their job primarily as a job of forming a bond, a relationship with the student. I'm referring to the 4th commonplace in John Dewey's description of the act of education, namely the subject matter. It's the subject matter which seems to take up so much of the teacher's time and attention that many teachers forget that their job really was to relate, that they didn't have to really teach, that in fact if they taught less, it would be so much better for the children. Martin Buber had actually put it across very well, the fact that there has to be a subject matter, but that this subject matter is not for teaching. This subject matter is an excuse for relating. In his book, I and Thou, he talked about the third end of this triangle, namely it, the world, that I and you, I, the teacher, and you, the learner, I and you relate in the context of it, that is, the world as it is today. And it's in our attempt to make sense of it, the subject matter, that we will come closer to each other. That by coming closer, we will be able to make better sense of it. Because the it that the teacher had learnt about during his or her childhood is actually not exactly the it that is there today for today's child to make sense of. Something which teachers forget. Teachers like to believe that they are permanently young. They like to believe that they understand the child because, of course, they have been children and also because they have been trained. And it's not always easy to remind them without quoting a formidable authority. And teachers like quotations. The authority of Plato, who had pointed out that the child is a foreigner. Treat this child, treat this foreigner well. Don't assume that you understand his or her language. Try to understand and remain alert that when you feel you have understood, you may in fact be wrong. It's difficult to make teachers feel that humble. And yet this idea of Martin Buber, which was taken forward by Paulo Freire in the context of it, is a very interesting idea for us to take forward our attempt to make sense of the core of teaching. You know, when Freire reconstructed this triangle of Buber, of I, you, and it, Freire thought that it's not enough for us to make sense of it by coming together as I and you. But together we must transform this it, because the world as it is not acceptable. Something that Maria Montessori would have been delighted to hear from Freire if the two had led coterminous lives. Something that would certainly have delighted John Dewey, who also thought that we cannot really understand the world without trying to disturb it. The great activist philosopher made it an essential job of the teacher and the pupil to nudge the world, to break it a little bit. That's what he meant by experiment. He didn't mean these inane activities which are carried out with the help of prefabricated material. What John Dewey meant was that we have to engage with the world and disturb it seriously enough so that people get upset. If people don't get upset with what teachers are doing, what they are doing may not be worth it, because teachers are here to create the future. And if the future were to be just like the past or the present, surely God had other things to do. He wouldn't have wasted his time in creating children. Yet, teachers like to cling to the idea that the best pupils under them in their institutions will be the ones which carry the stamp of their teaching. Teachers like to bask in the glory of their institutions and like to think that their children will be their projected selves and that they can produce these children. In fact, the terminology of production has taken over the teachers' discourse so much that we openly call ourselves as products of this or that university or this or that institution. If one looked at institutions as places which brought us together, which brought the teachers and the students together, not just to explore the world, but to disturb it, then no institution could be proud of those who are merely its products, which have not transformed the agenda of the institution, which have not updated the institution so that it can survive in a new world, which is a different kind of world from what it was when the learner was here with us. Now that we have broken that binary a little bit, and I hope that you are feeling a little relieved, and you're feeling that something has been taken off your neck, then perhaps it's possible for us to truly appreciate what Dr. Montessori had asked us to do about observing children. One of the central thoughts in Montessori's methods, perhaps you would all agree, even though I know that many of you have studied Montessorian thought far more deeply than I have had the opportunity to do, I still venture to think that you would probably agree that one of the most central themes in Montessorian pedagogic practice is the need to patiently observe. By observing the child, we learn where the child is in relation to the world. But observing is not enough. It's also necessary to know how to interpret what we have observed in a child or in a student. And that's where Montessori's challenge becomes more difficult. Because when we try to interpret what we observe in a child's behavior, it's then that we realize that it's not merely that we have to appreciate where the child is in his or her relationship with the world, but rather it's then we realize who the child is. Who is a far more difficult question to answer if you are not thinking in terms of group psychology or age-related psychological stages of anyone's vintage. If you are thinking of children as a constellation of tendencies, capacities, movements, and so on, then it's not easy to interpret your observations in the context of who the child is. Because the child is who in the sense that there is something unique about every child. Something which has become a bit of a refrain, or if not rhetoric, in progressive educational theory, but it's one of the least understood rhetorics of modern educational theory. Learning to notice what is truly individual about the child. The individuated child is the one that, as a teacher, one must know if one wants to relate to the child and form a bond which is based on affection and love and compassion and hope. If it's a bond that can sustain way beyond the time when the bond was formed and when the institution provided the opportunity of the bond getting formed. If the bond is to remain a memory which inspires this child when he or she is actually an old man or woman, then that kind of bond can only be formed by a teacher who attempts to individuate the child and doesn't merely see the child as an example of certain symptoms of an age group, a culture, a community, or a certain kind of collection of tendencies which have been analyzed by one or the other psychologist. The idea that good teaching can only be based on this understanding of the individual child is not particularly new. In fact, the idea is extremely old as the idea of education itself. But the idea rarely gets received without a resounding murmur from the world of teachers. The murmur which says that we can't look after every child in this specific individuated sense because there are so many children. The age of mass education has certainly created very significant barriers to this idea being properly understood, let alone being properly implemented. And we can't dismiss the teacher's anxiety and concern on this score by simply saying that today we don't have committed teachers or we don't have inspiring teachers. In fact, we have an unusually large body of inspiring teachers who are working in impossible circumstances in almost all parts of the world, something to which I will come in a moment or two. But in this age of mass learning, the tenets of behaviorism, long challenged by cognitive psychology, have come back with a big thud and have gained predominance once again in a new incarnation which is fully backed by the latest inventions in technology, and in some cases by attempts to theorize on the basis of these inventions. We have come to a point where the intended outcomes of learning have been so specifically, so meticulously prescripted that there is hardly any freedom left for the teacher in many systems of the world, including the systems which had in fact attained that freedom for their teacher at least 40 or 50 years ago. But the last 20 years have been a time of rather uninterrupted winter in Europe, let alone in North America. for that kind of teacher. During this period, which broadly can be seen as being synchronic with the rise of the slogan of globalization, during this period, many old ideas have come back and many progressive theories have been challenged, if not just ignored, in policy formulations in quite a few countries in the world. In this period, the idea that the job of the teacher is mainly to transfer knowledge and skills in a reliable manner has come back in a big way, an idea that essentially diminishes the job of the teacher. This idea, the new idea that a teacher's job is mainly to transfer knowledge, a body of knowledge from books to the child's mind, and certain skills which are necessary for children to become competitive in the context of what is now known as the convergent curricula, so that contexts wouldn't matter, that no matter where you learn, you will learn the same thing, and that thing will be worthless if you were trying to apply it in the specific context of your life, because it's supposed to be context-free, and it's supposed to permit you to become a global citizen, or at least a global salesman, or a knowledge worker who can go anywhere. And in that sense, somebody who asserts his freedom. The new information and communication technologies, known by the acronym of ICT, have become a vehicle of promotion of this idea. Technologies rarely have their own agendas. It's human beings in a political context who give them an agenda. And it's a sad reflection of our times that the ICT developments have taken on this agenda of diminishing the role of the teacher as somebody who works not for intended outcomes, but rather, what might be a little startling to say, for unintended outcomes. A point which actually the British curriculum thinker, Lawrence Stenhouse, had quite bluntly made in a critique of behaviorism as early as 1974 in his classic on curriculum development. In a long and sustained critique of behavioristic teacher training and theories of learning, Stenhouse had pointed out that it's not the predicted outcomes of teaching that count, that show the best potential of an institution. Rather, it's the unplanned and the unpredicted outcomes which are truly exemplary of the work of a great institution. When teachers are able to get surprised by what their children can do, rather than feel satisfied that children do exactly what I had taught. It's when the teacher has something new to look at in the child's work, which was never taught. It's then that a teacher truly succeeds. As Stenhouse defined this kind of success means that the child has now been inducted into a community of free human beings who relate to each other by means of independent and daring thought, and not by means of shibboleths. Stenhouse's idea that all education ultimately, therefore, is an attempt to enhance human freedom and dignity should be remembered as we attempt to, in a way, resurrect the idea of teaching in this age of technologically and economically driven ideas of teaching, which have very little to do either with what psychologists have told us, at least since the Second War, and what philosophers have always been telling us for more than 2 millennia. That it's not knowledge which teachers deal with. It's rather the desirability of knowledge that they establish. that this choice has been there for teachers all the time, whether they will transmit knowledge or will they set an example of the desirability of knowledge by proving to the child who is with them that knowledge is a nice thing, that knowledge actually helps make life happier. There cannot be a long enough list of thinkers and philosophers who have attempted to remind the teacher that establishing the desirability of knowledge is a far more challenging and worthwhile act to do than to transfer knowledge. Perhaps the oldest name I can think of in this long, long list is that of the Buddha, who had thought that knowledge is neither for possession nor is it for transferring, that knowledge actually is simply for solving the problem of life. It's said in a legend that a philosopher of his times by the name of Vatsigotra once visited the Buddha. The purpose of his visit to clarify a doubt, something which students are always fond of doing when they get a chance to meet their teacher. When Vatsigotra was presented to the Buddha, the legend goes, he wanted to know from the Buddha himself whether he believed that there was no self. Vatsigotra had heard that the Buddha was an anatmavadi philosopher, which would mean that he did not believe in the existence of a continuous self or soul, as some people put it. And therefore, Vatsigotra wanted to know from the Buddha himself whether it's true that he did not believe in the self. The legend goes that when Vatsigotra asked this question, the Buddha stayed silent. And after a few minutes passed, this visitor repeated his question. Students often think that the teacher hasn't heard, so they like to repeat, and this is what Vatsigotra did. He said, "Is it true that you don't believe in the self?" The Buddha still stayed silent. And this time, apparently, this visitor was a bit irritated because he had traveled a long distance to meet the Buddha. So he thought he should perhaps reformulate his question. Visitors often think, as students do, that the way they put the question, the teacher hasn't understood. So he reformulated the question and said, "So, sir, do you believe in the self?" But this time also the Buddha stayed silent. And now, in modern colloquialism, a little cheesed off, Vatsigotra left. And when he had left, the Buddha's attendant, Anand, asked him. He said, "Sir, you do teach that there is no continuous self. Why didn't you tell this man?" This is what he had come to find out. And the Buddha's answer, again according to legend, is extremely interesting and worth invoking this morning. His answer was to Anand. He said, "My teaching is not to possess a theory." This man was not looking for an answer. He was looking for a theory that he wanted to possess. My teaching is to solve the problems of life. That was not his purpose. Coming back to our times, friends, I had said that I would conclude this lecture by reflecting briefly on the kind of historical crisis which the idea of teaching and the profession of teaching, especially the profession of the teaching of the young, faces today. This crisis is only partly born out of the profession itself. it is a fact that the profession of teaching of the young has got enfeebled over the recent decades in parts of the world where it had gained a certain strength, where it had got professionalized. Even in those parts, the richer countries of the world, it's getting enfeebled. And in countries like India, where it was never a strongly preferred profession, teaching of the young has got further enfeebled. One sign of it, which is a bit of an ironical sign, even as one welcomes the increase in the number of women who opt for this profession, one notices that in patriarchal societies, which cover a category which covers almost the whole world, where men are dominant and their choices indicate where the world is going, it's very evident that fewer and fewer men are now preferring the profession of teaching of the young, which is causing different kinds of symptoms and disbalances, which are not of interest to us today, but as a symptom of the loss of status in this profession, it can be seen as a useful and reliable symptom. But there is a larger crisis to which many teachers are responding in their own, sometimes lonely ways, and occasionally, in collective ways. And this is a crisis brought about by the kind of developments that have taken up, that have shaped the present-day world. It's no more possible for teachers today to work in isolation from many institutions which are far more powerful than they are. Consider the modern media. Many teachers today act as actually nurses and doctors in their morning classes in primary schools and kindergartens to heal children who have been badly injured by a television program they saw with their parents till late in the night. Problems in the family, in the community, and indeed in the world itself have turned the modern school into a halfway house to a hospital. Teachers are unable to cope with the kinds of pressures which their children bring upon them, even as children themselves can't cope with those pressures. These pressures are ubiquitous. These pressures have no particular origin, and yet these pressures arise from everywhere. We sometimes like to reify the sources of these pressures by saying that these have arisen from the television screen, or from the internet, or from other invasive technologies. Sometimes we like to blame the politicians or the industrialists. But we know that what we are talking about is a loss of consensus. A consensus that bringing up children in a healthy, positive, and hopeful way is not just the teacher's responsibility, that it's a responsibility of everyone. If ever there was a rudimentary consensus around that issue, that consensus today has been lost. And teachers are working as if, like Sisyphus, blocking the downward journey of a huge rock all the time, feeling tired, losing health, feeling stressed in their daily lives in many ways that are very manifest, but in many ways that are not so manifest. UNESCO carried out several studies to understand the status of teaching over the last 15 years or so. And one of the editorials of UNESCO's flagship journal, Prospects, 3 years ago, brought out the main conclusion of these surveys. The title was, "Where Have All the Teachers Gone?" This title captures the problem of finding young people who have a positive outlook, who have the capacity to work hard, and who have the propensities to become good teachers, such young people are no more attracted by the profession of teaching because of the kinds of pressures this profession is facing today. For one thing, teaching makes unusual demands. Teaching demands that we use language as a means of relating. And yet language is what has lost in many contexts of present-day world, which is riddled with war. In one form or another, the hope that language can rescue the world is receding in so many corners of the world today, that the most developed countries of the world, which apparently continue to believe that they set up the model of development, earn the best part of their earnings from other countries by selling them weapons, both small and big. Even as there is a demand that the opium fields of Afghanistan should be destroyed, because opium is said to be a crop that has led to trafficking in drugs and various other ills of the modern world, there is no demand that the factories which produce small guns in Great Britain or tanks in Soviet Union or light machine in the former Soviet Union, or light machine guns, the brand names of which make modern Russia and America both proud of themselves, or cannons, which a country like Sweden, which hasn't itself fought a war for more than 170 years, produces with great pride and sells to countries like India. I'm referring to that Swedish cannon, which caused India to lose at least one prime minister in an act of violence, Bofors. There is a need for us to look at the impossibility of the very basic ingredients of an environment in which teaching can flourish. That basic ingredient would be physical silence and peace, in which it's possible to sit and reflect on where we are. It's only in that kind of absolutely minimalist demand that if there is no peace in the world, there is no peace in the mind, let at least there be physical peace for us to sit down. Even that minimalist demand is now finding it very difficult in many corners of the world to be met. Such a moment does, therefore, make it very difficult for teachers to stay hopeful that their profession matters, that the rhetoric that they make the future has some meaning. And yet, it's within the context of the attempt to theorize teaching that we can find some solace in this moment of great crisis, which we have to survive and live beyond. It's in that body of thought about the core of teaching that we can find solace. One such thought with which I would like to conclude, except for a point I had promised I would make about sadhana. One such thought arises out of the work of Dr. Montessori herself. In the concluding sections of The Absorbent Mind, she talks about teaching as a revelatory act, where she articulates a position that she has taken in many other books, including her classic, The Discovery of the Child. The position that the child will reveal herself, that there is something which is not predestined in the sense that we can find out in advance. That's what the word reveal means. It has an element of divinity to it. Something which one of the greatest practitioners of Montessorian thought in India, I'm thinking of the late Gijubhai, who under the influence of Gandhi and Montessori set up what probably was one of the prominent examples of indigenous Montessorian work, Dakshinamurti School in Bhavnagar, Gujarat, something which Gijubhai had articulated more simply by saying that God's design resides in the child, and it's not my attempt to read that design before the child decides to reveal it. The idea that the world cannot be predestined in ways that we can find out now what its destiny is, whether it's going to destroy itself or live on in the manner in which it's living now. The idea that it's an indeterminate place is an inspiring idea in this moment of crisis, when even progressive institutions and collectives are turning into cults, busy protecting themselves from outside influences, so scared of an explosive world situation that they feel they can't engage with other institutions and other ideas. Such a time is appropriate, indeed is most appropriate, for all thoughts to become inclusive, for bridges to be built between similar looking ideas. This is not a moment for us to become purists. Rather, it's the opposite moment for us to recognize in how many ways the same idea was expressed. And quite recently, the 20th century is not that old, and it's full of articulations of this hope. In fact, if one compares our present time with the time that prevailed in Europe before the Second War, perhaps we are still very fortunate. We are not yet at that point where it looked as if many struggles have been lost already. No, we are at a point where it would seem as if we tried harder, and if we tried with more open minds and with more daring hearts, that we will be able to resurrect some of the core ingredients of the idea of teaching, and we would also be able to celebrate the ultimate unknown, namely the child, whose celebration must include the promise not to try to know too much, and instead to cherish the mystery of the child. That, to my mind, friends, is really one way in which a teacher can relate to the theme of this Congress, sadhana. To stay engaged with the task and yet to remain aware of who one is and what one's limitations are. I like to think of sadhana as the work of somebody who is not always celebrated in the world of Indian classical music, the person who handles the tanpura, one who is able to remind the better known celebrity, the performer, how far he or she has gone now. At each moment, the tanpura reminds us of where we are. As teachers of the young, we are masons who work on the foundation. The foundation is not known once the building has been constructed. It's the facade which everybody sees. It's the visible part of the buildings that people notice. Teachers of the young work in that part which becomes subterranean, which is under the earth, and therefore which doesn't remain visible after the work has been successfully done. In that role as a mason who specializes in the construction of the foundation, the teacher has to continue to be inspired by thinkers who have reminded her or him that even though his task is great, in fact, in Indian tradition, it has been compared to the task of God himself or herself, Yet, the teacher must not take it too seriously or take himself or herself too seriously, because the teacher's task ultimately is to let the world move on, to enable it to move on more gently, more carefully, with a few more obstacles removed so that the real potential of the child would express itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Krishna Kumar. That was truly inspiring. Before we take a break and have some lunch, I'd like to make a couple more housekeeping announcements. The first announcement: as you leave this auditorium, on my left, on your right, as you go out on the right-hand gate and walk down, you'll see the AMI stall, the stall of the Association Montessori International. Somewhere near that stall, someone there will be able to direct you. There are registrations to AMI open. Please avail. I'm requesting all my Indian friends, please avail of the very special offer for Indian delegates, an introductory offer of registration if you register during this Congress. I also have another announcement to make. This is a request. As you noticed, perhaps, you do not have name tags or badges. We hope that we'll get to know each other so well that we'll remember one another's names and make friends during this Congress instead of just trying to read the badge as quickly as possible before we greet someone. But we do need to give our very young volunteers a way of distinguishing Congress delegates, Congress participants from other people who may be visiting this campus, as this campus is a very popular campus and many people come here. And the only way they have of recognizing that you are a delegate, you are a participant, is if you would so kindly carry with you and display in a visible manner the lovely pouches you were given, whether green or orange. Please, could you make an effort to carry that pouch with you as you move around the campus, as it allows our young volunteers to identify you easily. We do not necessarily need to have each person's name. We're not taking a roll call, but we do need to identify you. That's another request. Those of you who have not brought them today, perhaps it's our fault because we didn't make it clear enough. Could you kindly remember to bring it tomorrow and the day after? If you have not collected it, you can still collect it from the registration office in the morning, or perhaps even now in the afternoon. A reminder that during the lunch break, you have time to visit, or during and after the lunch break, during the breakout sessions, you have time to visit the Dastakar Craft Fair, where there are, as I said in the morning, many things for you to look at. And a reminder to please look at your program of breakout sessions, because there are interesting, different breakout sessions each day in some aspects, and some are continuous for all the different days. So please do look at that program and choose a breakout session that would interest you. This afternoon, during the time for breakout sessions, we have something very special that I'd like to announce. We have here with us Mr. Peter Hesse, who's been doing some really wonderful work with young children from disadvantaged backgrounds in Haiti. Some of the poorest children in the world live there, and he's been doing work on Montessori lines with them. And he's made some wonderful discoveries of how this work empowers the children, yes, but also empowers those that teach the children. He also has discovered that you don't need very fancy qualifications to teach these children, but a willing heart is very useful. He has very kindly brought a DVD with him, which he'd like to share with us after we've had lunch, once the breakout sessions begin. And that DVD will be shown here in this room. And following the viewing of the DVD will be a discussion, an informal discussion session, which he would be very keen that those that are interested participate in. So I'm asking you to think about whether some of you would like to come back briefly and watch the DVD. Thank you.
The craft walk, which is going to commence at the little gateway to the crafts bazaar, so which is just to that side of the auditorium. And there is also going to be a tree walk, which will commence behind the banyan tree. So these will commence at these respective places at 2:15 in the afternoon. So if you could just assemble there if you're interested. Sorry. At 2:15. Sorry. What?
Mr. Peter Hesse.
Okay, the venues for all the other breakout sessions will be, if you could just approach any of the volunteers who are there, they will point you out. Otherwise, I will just be giving you the names of the cottages, and it may not add much value to you now. Okay, so if you could just approach them, they will be most happy to guide you there. Thank you so much. Enjoy your lunch. The breakouts are between 2:15 and 3:15 in the afternoon.
What time is it?